A Manifesto for Hope. Principle 5. You can judge the wisdom of any society by the investment it makes in its children. With my guest, Dr Celia Sadie, clinical psychologist and Director of Care and Wellbeing at Oasis Restore, England's first ever secure school based in Rochester, Kent. Thanks for coming in, Celia.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
It's brilliant that you're here, it honestly is. And it's great to be working together on Oasis Restore, isn't it?
It really is.
And this fifth principle in my book, you can judge the wisdom of any society by the investment that it makes in its children, begins by talking about perhaps the experience in my life that got me thinking along the lines that have led to Oasis Restore. It's been a long journey, as I'm sure we'll talk about together a bit later on, but it really all began here. When I first began Oasis, I had this, to call it a vision sounds a bit grand, but I wanted, when I grew up, type of thing, as a teenager, to set up a house and a school and a hospital. And I wanted to care for people who hadn't received care or the support that they needed. And the very first thing that I set up with my wife, whose name's Cornelia, we'd only just got married, was a house in Peckham in South London. And the reason we did that was because as I talked to people about setting up a school or a hospital, everybody said, it's impossible. Both those ideas are impossible. You'll have to run a house. And so that's how we got to setting up this house first. And it's how Oasis got its name, actually, because Cornelia said to me one day, we should call this house that we're setting up for these young people who will come out of care or off the streets and live with us. We should call it Oasis because it's like an oasis in the barren desert of their lives. And so we did. And we set up a charity to run it called Oasis, which is why we all work for Oasis now, kind of thing. Strange world, isn't it, how all these things happen? But anyway, the story is simply this. This was the mid-1980s. And we had nothing. I mean, no money, nothing. And it was so much agony to get this thing up and running. And the reason we bought a house in Peckham is because nobody wanted to live there, to tell you the truth. And so property was a lot cheaper. And we needed a big house. And we managed to get this house. The roof had blown off and the stairs were smashed in so you couldn't get upstairs. It was in a right old mess, but I knew we could get volunteers to do it up. And it was dirt cheap as a result, but it had 16 bedrooms. And so we got going, and Cornelia is a bit of an artist. She was training as an antique restorer until she married me. So she loves artwork, and she went round old junk shops collecting art, and she designed the colours for the walls and the furniture. And I got a big TV, and, we kitted this thing out. And I mean, Oasis was us, basically. So we really did it. And these young people started moving in, and I was expecting them all to be incredibly grateful that we were giving them a home and a bedroom, and it was beautiful. And, they all had their own cookers, and they had their own kettles in their rooms, and loads of stuff. I mean, you name it, was there. So all these young people started to arrive in 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and not one of them even looked at us. They looked down in their boots. Don't look up, don't smile at you, don't look at you, don't say thank you, don't say please, don't open a door for you, don't do any of this. And if that wasn't bad enough, they nicked everything.
Oh.
Yeah, over the course, I always say it was 3 weeks. I don't know if it was 3 weeks or 2 weeks or a month. I really don't. All the kettles disappeared from the rooms, all the artwork off the wall. Like they didn't seem to take care of what we created at all. And what really upset me was somebody stole a television I bought, but it's like this huge telly to watch Match of the Day on, and it was just nicked, and it was nicked by the people that we were caring for, who I realised had sold it on for cash for whatever, and I was really mad. I mean, I say it now as though I wasn't mad, but I was. I was really mad. And we've given all these years to get this thing set up for this ungrateful bunch, and all they do is complain about what they've not got. We haven't got kettles. Well, of course you're not, because you sold them, kind of all this kind of thing. And it took me ages to get over my anger. I was really angry. And I slowly realized, as I say in the chapter of the book, that the problem was mine, not theirs. But it was a giant journey for me to go on. And it dawned on me because I suddenly realized one day that if one of them was in a wheelchair with no arms or no legs, or a broken leg or a broken arm, I'd have opened doors for them. I'd have compensated for their disability, because it was on the outside and I could see it. And the way I used to say it then was, I realized that these young people had wounds on the inside, in their brains somehow. They didn't see the world the way I saw it. They were scared of the world. They were scared of me. They were scared of one another, perhaps scared of themselves, perhaps hated themselves. I didn't know. But I realized all their, what I described as dysfunctional behavior, well, it was just behaviors for a reason. There was there was something behind it. It was the symptom of something deeper. It was the symptom of wounds that I couldn't see. And I realized that I'd been wrong, and I had to somehow navigate for myself a journey to a place where I could be a little bit more gracious, a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more generous, because that's where these young people were, and kind of starved of love. Now, Celia, you're a psychologist. All of this was before. I'd never even heard anyone say the word trauma. I don't know if anybody did say the word trauma in them.
But probably not that commonly in that period either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think neuroscience was a thing. I think neurology was a thing, but they used to look at dead people's brains, but there was no MRI scanner. You couldn't take live images of what was happening in a child or an adult's brain. So none of that science had developed at all. And so it was my first kind of encounter with all of this. And I think I became not just interested, that's a terrible word. I came to understand that we didn't understand, and that we needed to understand. And of course, as we just said, now neuroscience is the thing, isn't it? It's the science of the 21st century, isn't it? Don't you think?
Yeah, extraordinary potentials being opened up. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I hear people say we understand, neuroscience helps, it gives us an understanding of the human brain. What I realize is it's beginning to give us an understanding of the human brain. We're just at the beginning, aren't we? And the first MRI scanners, because neuroscience is dependent on the MRI scanner. The first ones, I think I say in the book, the first one was introduced in the 80s in Scotland in a hospital, but they weren't introduced really until the 90s, and they became this tool for taking, you could actually see what was happening in a child's brain for the first time. And I know this is your expertise, but I think that what happened to me is because of what we call number 3, which is that house that I was telling you about. I began taking a bit of interest, and I read about John Bowlby, who I'm sure you know all about, but I'd never heard of this guy, but John Bowlby was a psychiatrist and a psychologist and all this kind of thing. And then I read about attachment theory. But what I realized, that it was all what's called behavioralism, i.e. John Bowlby in the 1950s, was very good with his colleagues about studying behavior and looking at a mum, or the attachment, the primary attachment, the primary caregiver, and the relationship between the child and the adult, and whether that was a good attachment and a stable attachment and a loving attachment, or whether the primary caregiver, the mum or whoever, was distracted by their own needs and not emotionally available to the child. And he worked out that the kind of primary attachment you had a huge impact on the kind of person you became and
Yeah.
the behavior
Yeah.
adopted. But the MRI scanner, for the first time, gave us the ability to look inside a child's brain and say, that is the impact it has. And I remember the first time I ever saw MRI scans they were of a 3-year-old's brain. I think they were pretty popular, probably because that's the only images available. But I remember this, that a healthy child, i.e. somebody who'd been loved and nurtured and cared for and cuddled and read to and felt secure, and that their primary caregiving, their parent was available to them emotionally and physically in terms of time and love. Their brains, I remember being shown by someone, looked to me, I'm sure you'll disapprove of this description, as a kind of big juicy cabbage.
I don't disapprove. It is an odd-looking thing.
Yeah, and then they showed me pictures of children's brains at 3. I remember that was the big point. Who'd not been loved, they'd not had a secure attachment because for some reason or the other, their mum or whoever hadn't been available to them. It's not to put the blame on the parent. Often they're in a situation where they've not got the emotional space. But these children hadn't been shown that love and attention given time. And their brains, again, bad description coming up, look to me like a shriveled walnut, and I'm allergic to walnuts anyway, so I don't like the shape of walnut.
No.
And there were these brains that were like, and I could actually see the difference.
Gosh.
And then there was all that stuff that got said, and I began to take on board about, the brain, the first 1,000 days of your life. And, for the first 1,000 days, that's the important time. And then there was another kind of wave a few years later that said, the first 5 years are the important time. And then more recently, there are books about the adolescent brain and how the adolescent brain develops. And I've worked out it's just because we've not had MRI scanners that long, is it? And slowly,
Good point.
in about 20 years' time, someone's going to write a book about the 50-year-old brain and how it develops, because there's these stages of development that we're slowly learning about, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
We now know that an adolescent's brain isn't like an adult's brain. So it's pointless trying to insist that a teenager, an adolescent, behaves like an adult. We know, don't we, that they've not developed the centers of the brain that gives them self-assurance, and their opinion of themselves is much more guided by everybody else's opinion of them, which is why dressing the same, looking the same, having the same labels is really important. Why they spend so much time looking in the mirror to be sure that they're going to be acceptable. And it's not because they're vain or they're immature or because of their hormones. It's to do with brain development, isn't it? Am I right about that?
Well, yeah, it's all in there. But I that's been a marvelous scientific advance to be able to really see what's going on in there and to recognize the structural differences between adolescent and adult brains. And I think it gives us amazing opportunities therapeutically, but it also should warn us that things like our age of criminal responsibility being 10 in this country are completely misconceived.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it, Celia? Because this understanding turns everything on its head.
It does,
doesn't it?
yeah.
We've learned more about the human brain in the last 30 years since the invention of the MRI scanner than we've learned in the whole of human history. One of the things I feel, I sometimes get called an educationist. I'm not sure I'm any of these things. I'm just someone who feels passionately about justice for young people and everybody, to tell you the truth. But what I see, for instance, in terms of education, is that we have a kind of 20th century pre-MRI scanner, pre-neuroscience scanner approach to education, which is like a straitjacket, when what we know now is that that's not the way a child's brain works, and an adolescent's brain works differently to that. And so you can do this straitjacket thing as hard as you like for as long as you like, but it ain't going to work because it's like a prehistoric understanding of a child when we got a 21st century understanding of the church. And so we end up with a 20th century approach to education in an age when we could have a 21st century understanding of this. And then we wonder why 3 out of 10 kids drops off this production line feeling like they're a failure. It's not that they're a failure, it's that we never understood them and what was going on in their heads and their brains. And I'm getting a bit, I'm passionate.
No, I'm there with
about
you.
this.
I'm there with you.
Yeah. So when a child, we now know, don't we, that when a child isn't nurtured and cared for and that primary attachment isn't there, because those early years are vitally important. It's not that all this other discovery negates those early years. Those early years are really important, but so are the adolescent years, and we'll discover so are the 20s soon, and we'll discover so are the 50s and all the rest of it. And that mental dysfunction arises for a reason. It's, it just doesn't happen. There's always a thing behind the thing, isn't there? So, it shows up, can show up as depression and anxiety and anger, failed relationships, addictions to sex or violence or alcohol or food or self-harm. But all of these things are just symptoms. That's, I think, what I've learned. And what we try to deal with in all our systems very often, our education system, the justice system, which we come on to talk about, is we try to deal with the behaviours and correct them. If we make it stern enough, if we exclude this child often enough, if we stand them outside a classroom and give them enough detentions, then their behaviour will change. Without understanding that ain't ever going to work, and it never has worked. But what you got to get at is the drivers, the thing behind the thing, the causes of all of this. And it always reminds me of, because Oasis runs some churches, as you know, and one of our churches in Waterloo is just up the road from the War Museum in central London. And the War Museum, before it was the War Museum, used to be an asylum.
Oh, yes.
It's built as the asylum, and in its history, back in the 18th century, back into beginning bits of the 19th century, the view was that if you were in an asylum, it was because you were mad, and they called you a lunatic, and that it was to do with the moon, but it was also to do with your moral depravity. And if you didn't behave right and do things wrong, you became mentally ill. And in the life of the asylum there, you could on Sundays, because they used, how do you cure this moral depravity? They used cold baths, they used cages, they used whips, extraordinary stuff. But you could actually take kids round and they prod these people who were slumbering with sticks. There's so much, it's so well documented, because you wanted these children to learn that they'd better be good, because if you weren't good, you were going to end up there. And it strikes me that the reality is we haven't actually come far, that we still cling to this thing. Good people are good because they're good, and bad people are bad because they do bad things, rather than digging behind it and beginning to understand what's going on in somebody's life.
Yeah, I agree.
My wife, Cornelia, often says to me that the more stressed I am, the more stupid I am. But the truth is, I know it's true. I get stressed and I do say daft things, do daft things. We all do, don't we?
Yes.
And I've learned now through my understanding of this new science, neuroscience, and what we can see and understand of a brain and how a brain is made up and how a brain works, is the more stressed I am, because our brains work, I'm going to ask you about this, from the bottom up. So our animal instincts are at the bottom and our kind of management centers at the top, isn't it? Our prefrontal cortex, as it gets called. So we get all of these emotions flooding into the lower parts of our brain, and we act on our emotions when we become overwhelmed, When we're not overwhelmed, our prefrontal cortex, our management center, says, now calm down. I know you want to punch him, but it's best to just open the door. I know he stepped in front of you, but don't be rude. Just smile and say thank you and move on. But as you become stressed, your emotions overwhelm your thinking, management, planning capacity, and you do things that you later regret and have to go around apologizing for. And I often think, I say to people, you may consider yourself to be wonderful because you do let people walk, go through the door in front of you, and you pride yourself that you're very controlled and very mature and stable. But it's simply because through life, you've been given the opportunity to develop the management center of your brain. And as it grows, it's far less overwhelmed by your circumstances. But those are the kids I meet, some of them in our schools or the youth clubs we run or the hospitals we work in with young people. You meet children who live in a state of stress and tension for most of their life because of their circumstances, because of their home life, because of the way they're treated, because they're afraid. So the stress level in their life, hyper stress, is so high that anything can switch them. I've learned through the work we do around the country, and I learned at number 3, that first hostel safe house that we opened and still run, that when a kid, switches, when they just flip like that, in actual fact, it's no good trying to get them to see reason. It took me ages to work that out, by the way, so I'm a bit stupid. But if I just left them to their own devices for half an hour, or a bit more, they'd calm down, and and I'd say, "Oh, you've calmed down now." And what I didn't realize is that their brain actually had calmed down, and their management center, their prefrontal cortex, had got control again instead of their kind of animal instincts or emotions. So when we say he calmed down, yeah, he did. And when I get mad at home or whatever, actually what I literally need to do is calm down, because when I calm down, I'll see it all a little bit more clearly. And what it strikes me we've got to do as a society is to allow our policies and our practices to catch up with what we actually know about reality. One of the funny things I always think, and there is actually a psychological theory about this, it's called misappropriated moral attribution theory or something like that. I talk about it in the book. It's, psychologists see, they always have fancy terms.
They overcomplicate everything. Oh, yes.
But anyway, so what it says is misguided moral attribution theory. It basically boils down to this. If I get cross, if I'm short, if I'm unkind, if, I send some rotten email to someone or I'm off with someone, it's because I've had a tough day.
Yeah.
It's because I got stuck on the tube. It's because I lost my bag. It's because I didn't get any sleep. It's because, something's gone wrong. It's because my car failed its MOT and I can't, Whereas if anybody else does those things, it's because they're a bad person. It's because they're morally broken. And so really moral attribution theory is about our misguidedness, isn't it? Where we judge, we know a little bit about what's triggering us, but we don't afford anybody else any of that. Well, I heard somebody say this once. This girl's father had been killed in a car crash, and it was his funeral. And I was taking the funeral, and I heard someone say about her, she was crying. Somebody said, "Oh, don't worry, she'll get over it. Kids are very resilient." And I've learned that children aren't resilient. We develop resilience. In fact, in my chapter, I use the illustration of a sponge. I say, we think a child's brain is like a sponge. You squeeze it and put loads of pressure on, and then you let go and it springs back into shape. I say, but it's not elastic like that. What actually happens with a child's brain is it's plastic, not elastic, like plasticine. And if all of the adverse experiences you encounter as a child, the lack of love, the presence of trauma, violence, rejection, abuse, these slowly shape your brain because it's plastic in an abnormal way, back to the walnut instead of the cabbage. So your brain doesn't spring back, it's stuck. Now, the good news is that because our brains keep developing throughout life, hence we're going to learn about 50-year-olds in the end when
Looking forward to that.
MRI scanners have been round. Because your brain keeps developing through life, creating new pathways, etc., there's always hope, isn't there?
Yeah.
There can always be change, but we can't judge everybody by the same criteria, because you've got to understand the thing behind the thing before you start. It's time, I think, for our practices to catch up with our science.